Okay, right. Project M Culture.
I think you're in for a wild ride.
It was brainwashing.
That's right, top secret stuff running from the early 1950s to at least the late 1960s. And get this, it was all under the super secret code name M-Culture.
M-Culture. Catchy. Yeah.
MK actually stood for the Technical Services Staff. That was the CIA's branch, focused on all things covert and, let's just say, unconventional.
Mind control.
They also had MK, NIOMI, and MK Delta,
Okay.
right? Rumors are flying about all these mind control techniques being used on U.S. prisoners of war by the Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans.
So the CIA felt like they had to catch up.
Exactly. They were in this race against their Cold War rivals, and they weren't afraid to, let's just say, get their hands dirty. You know about Operation Paperclip?
Vaguely.
Remind me.
That's when the U.S. recruited all those former Nazi scientists. And some of them had, well, messed with some pretty dark stuff during the war.
So these ex-Nazis are now working for the CIA, helping them develop mind control techniques.
Pretty much.
That's disturbing.
And it gets kind of worse. M-Culture wasn't the CIA's first rodeo with mind control.
Really?
They had already run projects like Chatter, Bluebird, and Artichoke, all trying to find ways to, manipulate people's minds.
Who was the mastermind?
Enter Dr. Sidney Gottlieb.
Dr. Sidney Gottlieb.
Head of M-Culture and a real shadowy figure in the CIA's technical services staff.
Sounds like a character right out of a spy novel. Oh, he absolutely was. Drug Fidel Castro with LSD. That was one of Gottlieb's schemes.
Okay, so what exactly were they trying to do with M-Culture? Did they really think they could create, mind-controlled assassins, like in the movies?
Well, their ambitions were definitely, let's just say, sky high. I mean, they wanted to develop truth drugs for interrogations. They wanted to figure out how to manipulate foreign leaders. And yeah, they were even exploring the possibility of creating a Manchurian candidate. And it wasn't just theoretical. They were pouring millions of dollars into over 150 different research sub-projects, all under the M-Culture umbrella. We're talking a huge chunk of the CIA's budget.
So what kind of crazy experiments were they running with all that money?
They were dosing people left and right, CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, even just random people off the street.
Wait, they were drugging unsuspecting citizens.
It gets crazier. They even set up these secret brothels. They called it Operation Midnight Climax, where they would slip LSD to men and film them without their knowledge.
This is just getting darker and darker.
And it wasn't just LSD either. They were testing heroin, morphine, mescaline, and a whole cocktail of other drugs. They even dabbled in hypnosis and polygraph examinations, trying to figure out how to break people down and extract information.
This is like some seriously messed up stuff.
Apparently not. They were so focused on their goals that they completely disregarded the Nuremberg Code, which clearly states that, informed consent is crucial for any human experimentation. They were treating people like lab rats with no regard for the potential consequences.
But surely somebody must have spoken up, right? Someone must have objected.
The CIA was very good at keeping things under wraps. It took a series of events. So in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms, he got wind that Congress was starting to sniff around, so he ordered the destruction of all M-Culture files. But a few documents survived. And in 1974, the New York Times, they dropped this bombshell report on all these illegal CIA activities, which included M-Culture.
And that sparked a whole wave of investigations, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Then in 1975, the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission, they held hearings and basically blew the lid off the whole M-Culture operation.
So the truth was finally out there.
It was. But that's just the beginning of the story.
Right, because now we have to ask, what happened to the people involved in M-Culture after it was exposed? Were they held accountable for all the messed up things they did?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. The CIA's destruction of most of the files made it really difficult to investigate and prosecute anyone involved.
So they basically got away with it.
Many victims and their families, they filed lawsuits. But the government, they fought tooth and nail to avoid liability. They invoked things like the Ferez Doctrine, which basically shields the government from lawsuits by military personnel.
So even though the truth came out, there wasn't really any justice for the people who were harmed.
Unfortunately, no. The people who orchestrated M-Culture, they were never held accountable.
That's just wrong.
Yes. But some people believe that mind control research might have continued under different names and, with different methods.
So there's a chance this kind of stuff is still going on somewhere.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And it's just one of the many unanswered questions surrounding MKultra. We still don't know the full extent of what happened, the long-term impact, or even the identities of everyone involved. Exactly.
Okay, the who, the what, and the why of M. But now I want to get into the nitty-gritty. How? Can you give us some specific examples of the experiments they conducted?
Absolutely. Let's start with the work of Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron in Canada. He was a psychiatrist recruited by the CIA to experiment with something called psychic driving.
Psychic driving. That sounds intense.
It was. Cameron, he believed he could erase existing memories and reprogram people's minds. He was trying to achieve, like, a real-life mind wipe. Pretty extreme. We're talking drug-induced comas, electroshock therapy, and relentless repetition of sounds and phrases.
He was basically torturing people in the name of science.
Essentially. And sadly, his test subjects were often patients admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University for relatively minor issues, like anxiety or depression. Many of them suffered permanent damage as a result of Cameron's experiments.
That's just horrifying. Imagine going in for anxiety and coming out with amnesia or even worse.
Yeah. Cameron would put patients into comas for weeks or even months at a time, bombarding them with noise or simple repetitive statements. Exactly. And the results were devastating. Some patients, they forgot how to walk, talk, or even recognize their own families.
It's hard to believe that someone who inflicted so much harm was actually, like, a respected figure in the psychiatric community.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how power and ambition can corrupt even the most brilliant minds.
It's a good reminder that we always need to be vigilant about ethics in research, especially when it comes to the human mind.
Absolutely. But Cameron's work was just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, what other substances were they experimenting with besides LSD?
They were casting a wide net, trying to find any drug that could potentially be weaponized. We're talking heroin, morphine, mescaline, psilocybin, and many more. Precisely.
I've never even heard of that one.
It's a drug that can induce a state of catalepsy. Basically, you become like a living statue, completely immobile and unresponsive.
That sounds terrifying. What were they hoping to do with that?
Well, documents suggest they were interested in using it to incapacitate enemies or even create a kind of zombie soldier who could be remotely controlled.
Zombie soldiers? Yeah. This is getting into some seriously scary territory.
It does sound like something out of a horror movie. But the CIA was dead serious about exploring these possibilities. And Bulbocap-9 wasn't their only foray into the bizarre.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
Like pulling rabbits out of hats.
Not quite. They were more interested in the potential applications of illusion, suggestion, and misdirection for, espionage. They even hired John Mulholland, a famous magician, to write manuals for the CIA on sleight of hand and secret communication techniques.
So they were training their spies to be magicians. That's actually kind of cool in a strange way.
It shows just how far-reaching MKultra's ambitions were. They were willing to explore any avenue that might give them an edge in the world of espionage and mind control. That's exactly right. The destruction of most MKultra files means that we may never know the full extent of what happened during those years.
Well, what we do know is already disturbing enough. This is a seriously dark chapter in American history.
It's a story that reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, however noble the intention, can sometimes lead to very dark places.
Fascinating.
Oh, wow. Lay on me.
This is about the unexpected connection between these covert experiments and, the counterculture of the 1960s.
Yeah, a little bit.
Take Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Okay.
He was actually a volunteer in MKultra experiments at Stanford University.
Yeah, I did hear about that. He was given LSD as part of the study, right?
Shaped his worldview.
I can imagine.
Some believe that his involvement in MKultra, it kind of helped spark his interest in psychedelics and, contributed to the rise of hippie culture. So the CIA might have accidentally helped launch a countercultural revolution.
Kind of ironic, huh?
It is.
The lyricist for the Grateful Dead.
Wow, so some of the most iconic figures of the 1960s counterculture might have had their minds altered as part of a CIA experiment.
It's a compelling thought, isn't it? The tendrils of MKultra might reach further than we realized, touching even the fabric of American culture.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how many other artists, musicians, writers might have been unknowingly influenced by MKultra.
It's a question we may never be able to fully answer, but it does highlight the unintended consequences these experiments could have.
It's kind of creepy, actually. The idea that the CIA might have had a hand in shaping, the cultural landscape of the 1960s is both fascinating and disturbing.
It certainly raises questions about the ripple effects of covert operations. The impact could be far more widespread and subtle than we imagine.
Okay, the people experimented on without their knowledge or consent.
Their stories are truly the most tragic aspect of this whole saga.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of them sued the government and received compensation.
Yeah.
But was anyone ever held accountable for the harm that was done?
Sadly, no. The CIA's efforts to destroy evidence and the government's use of legal loopholes like the Ferris Doctrine, it made it very difficult to hold anyone responsible.
The Ferris Doctrine. Remind me what that is again.
It's a legal principle that basically prevents members of the military from suing the government for injuries that occurred during their service.
Ah, right.
And the government used this to shield themselves from lawsuits filed by M-Culture victims who were, in the military.
So they basically got away with it.
To a large extent, yes. The people who orchestrated and carried out these experiments were never brought to justice.
That's incredibly frustrating.
Oh.
It feels like a huge injustice.
It's a sentiment shared by many who've studied M-Culture.
It also makes you question the whole idea of government transparency and accountability. If they could get away with something like this, what else might they be hiding?
That's a valid concern. M-Culture serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for government overreach and the importance of a vigilant and informed citizenry.
It's a story that should make us think critically about the limits of power and the importance of protecting individual rights.
Absolutely. But despite the darkness surrounding M-Culture, there are a few, glimmers of hope. The exposure of the program, however incomplete, did lead to some positive changes.
Oh, that's good to hear. What kind of changes?
For one, it sparked a national conversation about the ethics of human experimentation. Remember the Nuremberg Code we discussed earlier?
Yeah, the set of ethical principles for human experimentation that came out of the Nazi war crimes trials.
Right. M-Culture made it clear that those principles weren't always being followed, even in the United States.
So did the government take steps to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again?
They did. The revelations about M-Culture, along with other human experimentation scandals, they led to stricter regulations and more oversight for research involving human subjects.
So in a way, the victims of M-Culture helped pave the way for better protections for future research participants.
Exactly. Their suffering, though unjust, it contributed to a greater awareness of ethical principles and stronger safeguards in research.
That's a powerful legacy, even if it's a bittersweet one.
It is. It reminds us that even in the darkest of chapters, there can be seeds of positive change.
Speaking of change, what about the CIA itself? How did the exposure of M-Culture affect the agency? Did it lead to any reforms? What kind of resistance?
Well, some argued that these kinds of programs were necessary for, national security, and that any restrictions would hinder their ability to gather intelligence.
So they basically tried to defend their actions.
In some cases, yes. They argued that the Cold War was a different time, and the threats they faced, well, they justified extreme measures.
But surely they realized that drugging unsuspecting people and erasing their memories crossed the line.
The ethical implications were debated, a time of intense paranoia and secrecy.
So they were caught up in the ends justify the means mentality.
To a certain extent, yes. But the exposure of M-Culture forced them to confront the consequences of their actions and consider the need for greater accountability.
So what kind of reforms were implemented? Did the CIA actually change its ways after M-Culture?
It's hard to say for sure. The CIA is inherently secretive, and much of its inner workings remain, hidden.
So we don't really know if they learned their lesson?
Not definitively. But the scrutiny brought on by M-Culture and other scandals did lead to some changes. In 1976, President Gerald Ford, he issued an executive order banning experimentation with drugs on human subjects without informed consent.
That's a big step in the right direction.
Yes, but it's important to remember that these changes were often the result of public pressure and legislative action, not necessarily a change of heart within the intelligence community.
So it's an ongoing battle to hold them accountable and make sure they operate ethically.
Absolutely. Transparency and oversight are essential to prevent abuses of power.
It makes you wonder what other secrets might still be lurking in the shadows.
It's a question that haunts researchers and journalists who delve into the world of intelligence and covert operations.
You name it. It's almost hard to believe this was like a real program.
It's like something out of a spy thriller. But, the truth is often stranger than fiction.
It really makes you wonder what was going through their minds. Like, why were they so obsessed with mind control in the first place?
To understand that, I think we need to, step back and look at the bigger picture. M-Culture wasn't just some rogue operation. It was a product of its time, the Cold War.
Right.
Imagine the world back then, right? The US and the Soviet Union locked in this, ideological struggle. Both sides racing to develop new weapons, new technologies.
The CIA was basically trying to, keep up with the Soviets. They were afraid of falling behind in the espionage game.
Exactly. There were all these reports of Soviet and Chinese intelligence using mind-altering drugs and psychological techniques on prisoners of war. And, well, this sparked a wave of paranoia within the U.S. intelligence community. They felt like they had to stay ahead of the curve no matter the cost.
So MKulture was born out of this fear, this Cold War paranoia.
A way to gain an edge in this high-stakes global chess match that could win the Cold War.
It's a chilling thought, but I guess it does make sense in the context of the times.
This was a time when the threat of nuclear war was very real. People were living with this constant sense of dread. The stakes were incredibly high, and both superpowers were willing to go to extremes to ensure their survival.
It's a reminder that even in a democracy, the government can sometimes overstep its bounds, especially when it comes to, national security.
MKulture is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of, transparency and oversight in government. It's a story that should make us think critically about the balance between security and, individual freedom. Absolutely. MKulture reminds us that even the quest for scientific advancement must be guided by strong ethical principles and, a respect for human dignity.
Okay, so we've explored the, origins and motivations behind MKulture. But I keep coming back to this one question. Do we really know the full story?
We may never know the full extent of what happened. That's part of it, the destruction of evidence. Remember when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all those MKulture files in 1973?
Yeah, that was like a blatant attempt to cover up the whole thing. But how much was actually destroyed?
The vast majority of MKulture records were lost forever. Thousands of pages of documents, including research findings, operational details, even the names of many participants were just wiped out.
So we're essentially trying to piece together a puzzle with, most of the pieces missing.
That's a good way to put it. We're left with a handful of surviving documents, the testimonies of a few key individuals, and, well, a lot of speculation.
That's incredibly frustrating. It feels like we're only getting glimpses of a much larger and darker picture.
And that's why the mystery of MKulture endures. The lack of complete information, it just fuels all sorts of conspiracy theories and speculation. Even though the program ended decades ago, it continues to, fascinate and intrigue us.
It's a story that refuses to stay buried, constantly resurfacing in new forms and sparking, renewed debate. So what does MKulture tell us about the world we live in today?
It reminds us that the thirst for power and control can lead individuals and institutions, down dangerous paths. MKulture serves as a warning, urging us to be vigilant about government overreach and the ethical implications of scientific research.
It's a story that should make us question, to demand transparency and to never forget the importance of individual rights. Well, this has been a truly deep dive into the dark world of MKulture.
We've uncovered a lot, but just like the program itself, the full truth, it remains shrouded in mystery.
So, to our listeners, what will you uncover?